I selected this topic, the macroeconomic framework of India. I have a reason to do that because these are very different times. The world, it's creating an unimaginable level of global crisis. It's like war, climate crisis, debt crisis, energy crisis. So we name it as polycrisis. And this polycrisis is a production of an expanding zone of new unknowns. We call it as radical uncertainties. So, what could be the macroeconomic framework when we face the radical uncertainties? So, that's what we need to look into. For instance, after the global financial crisis, when the world reached a Minsky moment. You know what is Minsky moment? In capitalism, we say the financial systems, that has an intrinsic instability in it. So the moment we experienced after the global financial crisis, that Minsky moment, the monetary policy framework was crucial. And the world was dealing with the monetary macro policy tools to deal with that Minsky moment. And we know that it didn't work. We didn't believe that time in the redominance of the public finance, but beyond a point, the monetary macro policy tools didn't work. Why I said this? You can recall that the interest rate, we kept it lower, and once it reached the liquidity trap moment, then the monetary policy failed to trigger the global economic growth recovery process. So it was going even negative. So when monetary policy has got limited impact on the global growth recovery process, what could be that redominance of the public financial policy tools? That was the moment in which the world was looking into the redominance of the public financial management tools or the fiscal policy tools. Then we had a lot of public financial management reforms. We had stimulus packages, in that moment. But later on, we realized the importance of a proper fiscal policy and monetary policy coordination. Now, let's take the contemporary moment. This ongoing acceleration of the climate change crisis, that's actually exposing a humanitarian crisis. And we know the vulnerability of the food security systems. We know the vulnerability of the energy transition system. So what could be that macroeconomic framework India should be thinking to deal with this global crisis? So that's exactly what we need to look into this moment. And recently, I attended a meeting in ODI London. My former boss, Ratin Roy, you all know about Ratin Roy. He was the member of Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. He was my boss. He was a director of NIPFP. So he invited me to he's a managing director of, ODI London. So he invited me for that conference, and that conference was an eye-opener moment for me. The Adam Tooze, the director of the European Institute in Columbia University, he was the professor who talked about this polycrisis moment for the first time so effectively. So whatever I have articulated right now, we can mold it into a term, polycrisis. So this polycrisis is what I articulated as in times of war, climate, debt crisis, energy crisis. It's like a multiple crisis, and we need to have a framework to deal with this multi crisis or a poly crisis. Now let's look at the status quo. What is happening right now in India? Let's take up the public financial management part. Debt restructuring is a crucial component to deal with this poly crisis. And we are not facing a moment just like Pakistan or Sri Lanka just because we don't have a huge presence of donors in the debt market. We don't have huge external debt. So we are sound in terms of reducing the external debt over time. If you look into the financing pattern of deficit, we know that the internal deficit is huge, and we also have taken a transition from seigniorage financing, that is the RBI RBI through, this treasury bills and all financing the fiscal deficit. That is, in layman's term, it's like a printing of money and financing deficit. We have taken a lovely transition from seigniorage financing to the bond financing right now. Now, to face this energy crisis, what is the articulation? Within this financing pattern of the fiscal deficit, a thematic financing is articulated as climate bonds. And we need to say that the sovereign bonds, which is earmarked for tackling the green infrastructure or the climate energy crisis, if that is working or not, we need to wait and see. But that's the way we responded through the debt restructuring within the financing pattern of fiscal deficit. So that's the way we articulated. Now, coming to the bigger questions. The donors in the external, when the debt restructuring articulation, when that is happening around the world, donors, they tend to look into how much dollars are taken and how much dollars are repaid. To what extent you used it for the humanitarian cause or for, the non-productive cause doesn't matter. But in terms of repayment, it has to be at the right time and it has to be paid in dollars. That's the articulation of the external financial markets. But we need to take a relook into it and ask the question, fiscal space for what? We have to ask the question, what is the use of the debt we have taken from the market, internal or external? As long as the lenders are only interested in how much debt we are paying back, the context really matters. We don't mind about why you are using or what you are using the debt for. That will lead to a kind of transition in the expenditure design of any country. So that's the global concern right now, that the fiscal policy for what? That's a crucial question we need to rethink, rather than take the debt, repay the debt at the right time. Use of the debt, we don't we don't mind. We are not concerned at all. That's articulation. Now, among the global economists, Oliver Blanchard came up very vocally responding to this, and he came up with the proposition for this macro framework, like, if you have high debt, you need to articulate to reduce your output gaps. In the macroeconomic framework, this output gap is a crucial variable, and this output gap is also a controversial variable. In the sense, the output gap we measure as a gap between your potential output and actual output. It is measured in terms of, in the native economy, it is measured in terms of employment. But in the context of India, it is measured in terms of your potential output and actual output in terms of GDP. And we know that the GDP methodology, it has undergone a transition. There is data fundamentalism and there are data gaps. And these are, rolling into a crisis in which we created the debt numbers. And we are now arguing about the way we are floating the surveys, and the methodology is not correct. The sampling is not correct. But the reality is that most of the elements or the components that go into the GDP are extrapolated due to the lack of data. So that's the reality with the actual output. Now comes to the potential output. Potential output is unobserved variable. You need to create the potential by looking into the econometric methodology, and we use the filters. You look into the components of the cyclical and the the structural elements into it. You call the trend as your potential GDP by taking out the cyclicality. This is what we call as filters, using HP filter and Kalman filter.